While the armies of Napoleon Bonaparte had been beaten back and finally defeated in 1815, the ideas that those armies had taken with them across Europe and as far as Russia remained even after Napoleon and the French had withdrawn, had been beaten back. And those ideas of liberty and equality and rights of man, gained power, gained momentum, and they came to dominate the thinking of many different groups as the 19th century progressed. And so, while the French Revolution was done, an age of revolutions had been opened and would continue really for the first half of the 19th century. At the end of the French Wars, the Napoleonic Wars, the winners got together, and including the French, they didn't want to leave them out completely, got together at Vienna in Austria to determine what the peace would look like. Now, the people in charge of this were dominated by the conservative leader of Austria, the Prime Minister, Clemens von Metternich. And Metternich's goal, and many of the people who were at the Congress of Vienna's goal, was to establish a very conservative, sort of traditional form of leadership that would, as much as possible, replicate the world before the French Revolution. And the primary idea of this would be to create a balance of power, that you had legitimate old powers, and these would include the British, they would include the Austrian Empire, they would include the Prussian Empire, they would include the Russian Empire, they would even, like I said, include the French, because France was big, and France was wealthy, and France was powerful, and you couldn't just isolate it or ignore it. But those five powers were meant to maintain a sort of equilibrium. None of them were to get too big and powerful. No new Napoleons. On the fringe of this was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was problematic. I mean, they had European territories, and they were an empire and legitimate in the kind of way that Metternich was interested in, but they were fragile. They were weak. The flip side of the balance of power was, while you didn't want anybody too powerful, you also couldn't afford a country that was so weak that its weakness destabilized the system. So the balance of power system was put together to try to maintain a Europe that could maintain stability. And these conservative forces at the head of these five major empires were going to work together to keep that happening. And to give them their credit, they do a pretty good job. From 1815 until 1914, Europe doesn't have any really major land wars again. There is no new Napoleon. There is no new sort of existential threat for all of these empires. When they do finally fall apart, it's going to be a massive disaster. But for the time being, Metternich's got what he wants. Metternich goes so far as to attempt to establish, well, in conjunction with the Russian Tsar and the leader of Prussia, a holy alliance, a really anti-revolutionary combination that is going to work together to snuff out any of the fires of revolution that might pop up in Europe. The British don't jump in on this. They're not really interested in getting involved in any more continental problems. They had enough of that land war in Europe kind of thing, and they're going to maintain their empire. The French, not that interested in linking themselves to it either, but obviously interested in maintaining stability. The Holy Alliance is never as effective as Metternich would have liked. One of the places they could have stepped in and really made a big difference was that Napoleon's conquest of Spain had really shaken that empire up. And especially the Central and South American parts of the old Spanish Empire were now breaking free. And in the 18-teens, 20s, and even into the 30s, you see leaders like José Martín and Simón Bolívar lead very successful revolutions that break up the old Spanish Empire. Even the Portuguese possession of Brazil manages to split away and become independent. Technically, the Holy Alliance should have squashed all that, but in this case, it's the British, and to a certain extent the Americans, who keep that from happening. The British enforcing, really, the American Monroe Doctrine sort of make it known to Europe that the Americas are no longer open to new colonization. And so the Holy Alliance is limited to really just a European focus from the very beginning. Even there, they're going to run into problems as the Ottoman Empire deteriorates in places like Greece, and the Balkan states begin to break away. There's so much desire on the part of both the Austrians and the Russians to take advantage of this breakup that sometimes their cooperation isn't really very good. Now, this first 3-4 decades of the 19th century is a period that brings a lot of isms into our vocabulary. Historians love isms. Read about the isms in the textbook, learn about the isms. Conservatism, that's Metternich. It's the idea of legitimacy, it's that there's a ruling class, that you respect their position in society, and that they are the natural leaders. They're the ones who should be deferred to. Nationalism, that's a little bit more debatable ism. The conservatives aren't really crazy about nationalism. Be careful when you think about things in today's terms. Nationalism then was a very frightening idea. It tends to go along the lines of origin or place of birth and that kind of identification. But it also can be linguistic, it can be cultural, it can be social. And so multinational empires, like the Austrian Empire and the Russian Empire, and the Ottomans, as it turns out, have to be very careful of nationalism because it's a dividing force for them. The various groups within their multinational empires, if they all want to be nationalistic, are going to pull away from the central power. Republicanism, that's an idea that Americans, that we are really very familiar with. The idea of, in our case, one man, one vote. The United States really leads the way with that. By the mid-1830s, the United States is practicing essentially an adult white male one man, one vote practice, which makes them remarkably democratic and Republican in their governmental practices. The British follow suit in the 1830s with reform bills and acts to more democratize the process, to make their government more representational of the people. To a much lesser extent. You're going to see calls for it, but not much implementation during the first half of the 19th century in the rest of Europe. Socialism is an outgrowth of this new industrial economy with a big working population that's interested in having the voice of the people represented. Socialism is championed by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. They write the book, literally, on socialism and communism. And this is going to be an effort to have the will of the common people become preeminent in society. And then finally, liberalism, and this is classical liberalism. Again, be careful of the kind of words we use today, the definitions for liberalism. This liberalism takes a very small government, think more libertarianism, very small government, hands-off sort of approach to economic developments. Leave it alone. Let natural forces take place. And we're going to get liberal philosophers like David Ricardo and Thomas Malthus and others who say that there are laws of economics that are natural laws and have to be left to play themselves out. Finally, this is really going to be the era that sees the demise of slavery. Slavery in Europe, the language of the revolutions, the liberty and the equality, it's just going to wind up getting hung up on the hypocrisy of slavery. And so Britain will lead the way, but other European nations will follow. And eventually, even the United States, and finally, in the 1880s, Brazil, will all give up slavery as the 19th century goes along. And a lot of it's because of the kind of ideas and philosophies that come out of this age of revolutions.